Our swing state focus now shifts to the state of Wisconsin, where the battle for the White House has become, not surprisingly, too close to call. Today, we're joined by Craig Gilbert, the political denizen of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, who the Columbia Journalism Review has called the most political science-friendly reporter in America. I think you're about to learn why. From Ballard Studios in Washington, D.C., another special election edition of 13th and Park.
You and I can differ, but that doesn't mean you and I cannot be friends.
That often is missing in politics.
We went from North Korea to M&M. That's a lot, man.
Aliens could have invaded and nothing would surprise me at this point.
It's a nightmare.
Those are the facts.
We have to solve everything.
What's in this tea?
Craig, welcome to the show. For me, it feels like old home week, talking to someone so steeped in politics in Wisconsin. I cut my teeth in a lot of ways with former Governor Tommy Thompson and that gang. It was quite a period in Wisconsin history. A lot of big things happened for the state.
Yeah, and I cut my teeth as a political reporter in Wisconsin on those elections, too. I mean, a totally different world than the world we're living in today in so many ways.
So let's set the table a little bit. Wisconsin is a swing state for very clear reasons. It's very tight there. With the exception of the Obama elections in 08 and 12, it's been a razor-thin margin. Gore was like 5,500 votes. More recently, Donald Trump carried it by, I think, 16,000. Joe Biden by 20,000. Very, very tight at the margins, as they say. So why is this election maybe a little different than the ones you've seen before?
Well, the map is changing. And, Wisconsin in many ways is a different 50-50 state than it was 20 years ago. You've got Republicans making gains among rural voters, but losing ground among suburban voters. And those changes have kind of canceled each other out. And, this is the third time Donald Trump's going to be on the ballot. The lines, the geographic lines and the demographic lines are pretty well drawn. And, you mentioned the last two elections, all the polling, half the state is trending red, half the state is trending blue. I don't know what's going to happen, but the thing that would surprise me the most is to see the election results deviate significantly from 2020.
You start, of course, with what I used to call the Dane of my existence, Dane County. So the bane of my existence, you have Dane County, you have Milwaukee that are overwhelmingly blue.
Yeah.
Where else would Kamala Harris and her team be looking for votes in Wisconsin?
Sure. But first, one word about Dane, and I don't think everybody outside Wisconsin appreciates this. It's not only very blue, but it's been growing and getting bluer for decades. John Kerry won Dane County by 90,000 votes. Joe Biden won it by 180,000 votes. So in a state that's routinely decided by 20,000 votes or less, that's a shift of 90,000 net votes for Democrats over that period. And he won it by like 30,000 more votes than Hillary Clinton won it by. So Republicans have to make up for that particular X factor on the map. But Democrats know they're probably going to lose more ground in a lot of small towns and rural counties. They'd like to minimize those losses. I mean, one kind of very strategic area is the Fox Valley. I mean, we talk about these very red and blue parts of Wisconsin, right, but the area around Green Bay and Appleton is much more purple. And it's not only more purple, but it's not like oscillating wildly. It does swing, but it's not unambiguously trending in one direction. So that's a real battleground for both parties. And Western Wisconsin is another battleground because that's Obama-Trump country. And Democrats have done really well with rural voters there for a long time, but it's swung pretty hard for Trump. And they're hoping to right the ship a little bit there as well.
Where else do they look? Do they try to make any inroads in Dane County and Milwaukee? Do they try to really go after the purple of, of Green Bay?
Donald Trump actually went to Dane County. I mean, I think Tommy Thompson, was yelling in his ear, we got to lose Dane County by less. And on paper, that's very true. I'm not sure how much impact a single visit like that is going to have. One big question in my mind is whether he can make more inroads in rural Wisconsin and northern Wisconsin and central Wisconsin. The swing was so dramatic in 2016, and he continued to make inroads in 2020, but they were much smaller. So is he maxing out in rural Wisconsin? Maybe. But if he is, he's got to find those votes elsewhere to counteract, the decline in the suburbs and the Dane County factor. And so The suburbs are a big deal. They've been kind of persistently shifting away from Republicans in the last 8 years. So Republicans are hoping to steady the ship there. And then, I mentioned these other battlegrounds. I think Republicans would like to lose the city of Milwaukee by less. And they hope that these trends we're seeing in the polling with Black and Hispanic voters helps them do that. And they'd like to do better in these small blue-collar cities all across the Wisconsin map, because what we've seen with working class voters shifting towards Republicans encourages them there.
You think the Republican convention being in Milwaukee did anything for?
I think it may have helped, but it's really on the margins. I mean, it's one of those things. There's a long list of things like that. The Tim Walz effect in western Wisconsin. A lot of things that are very much on the margins. But of course, if it's close enough.
They say that on the economy, voters tend to prefer Trump. On character and personality, they prefer Kamala Harris. What wins out there?
That's another reason why it's so hard to handicap this race. I talked about the cross currents in the map, but we've got these cross currents in public opinion, leaving a lot of voters cross-pressured, as pollsters say. One classic example of that is undecided voters that don't like either candidate, and Republican voters that want to vote Republican, don't want to vote Democratic, but do have significant qualms about Donald Trump. These are not big groups of voters, but they are on the margins, and they do kind of populate that dwindling group of undecided voters in Wisconsin. So, it's why it's hard to know which way it's going to swing. We saw in 2016, after most of the polls were done, this group of voters, the double haters, and there were a lot more of them back then, swung to Trump and swung Wisconsin to Trump.
What under the economic umbrella seems to be the most predominant driver of potential voter behavior in Wisconsin?
Yeah, I think it's inflation. I think it's prices. Wisconsin is probably not too much different from a lot of other battlegrounds. You mentioned abortion. The state laws on abortion, Wisconsin is a state where abortion does loom. The issue is going to be back before the state Supreme Court, which has shifted from a conservative majority
more liberal,
to a liberal majority. And abortion really drove this huge Democratic victory in 2023 that tipped the state Supreme Court in that direction.
In terms of what's going to influence the few people left who are still trying to make up their mind, what do you think the wedge is? And in particular, independents in a state where you don't have party registration, you have election day registration itself in terms of being able to vote. How difficult is it for a pollster to really understand fundamentally the state of Wisconsin?
It makes the voter file either a lot less useful or requires a lot more work to make it useful, because everybody wants to know, when they're reaching out to voters in the voter file, what are they? And in Wisconsin, you not only have no registration by party, but you can't even tell from the voter file whether someone has been voting in Republican primaries or Democratic primaries. And the other problem in Wisconsin is if you just use demographics to kind of impute partisanship to voters, well, Wisconsin is really idiosyncratic when it comes to these demographic patterns. It's a very white, very blue-collar, heavily rural state that demographically speaking should be a red state.
Right.
But it's not, because those groups are less Republican in Wisconsin, a lot less Republican than they are in some other states. So it is a huge challenge. It helps that Wisconsin has really high turnout rates. But again, we've seen some pretty notorious misses in polling in the two Trump elections. And so this is a big challenge trying to get the electorate right. One other thing I'll just add when we're talking about the schizophrenic political character of the state is we have the oddest political couple in the U.S. Senate, the two same state senators that are further apart ideologically than any other
ever imagine
pair of senators. And any senators in recent history, and Tammy Baldwin, who's on the ballot, and Ron Johnson, who squeaked by for re-election in 2022.
What's interesting, let's get to the Baldwin race. That seemed to be kind of a 5, 6, 7, 8-point race. Now it's gotten much tighter in the last week or two or three, according to a lot of polls.
Right.
Does Kamala Harris's chances of prevailing in any way, shape, or form depend on how well Tammy Baldwin does against her opponent?
I think there could be some dynamic in both directions between these two races. I think Eric Hovde's chances of beating Tammy Baldwin do depend on Donald Trump's ability to beat Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket. I think most people think that in the end, and you're not going to be able to compare the races apples to apples because of the role of third-party candidates, but I think most people expect Tammy Baldwin's margin, whatever it is, to be better than Kamala Harris's margin. I think there's going to be some gap between these races. I think that gap has narrowed. And the question is, how big does it have to be? And if Donald Trump does need to win Wisconsin for Eric Hovde to beat Tammy Baldwin, how much does he need to win it by? But it's a close race. It's tightened. And the gap between these races is tightened.
So RFK Jr. always seems to keep popping up. Wisconsin obviously is one of the states where his name is still on the ballot.
Yeah.
Obviously, just intellectually, you say, well, if it's a 50-50 race and RFK Jr. gets 2 points or something, which he very well could, if not more, that could flip it one way or the other, and who knows where it's coming from.
When he first got into the race and Biden was still the Democratic nominee, I think people assumed Democrats were very nervous. And I think in a lot of the polling now, when you do the head-to-head and compare it to the multi-candidate ballot, Kamala Harris does better with the multi-candidate ballot question than she does with the head-to-head. So that would suggest RFK's presence on the Wisconsin ballot. I think he's also on the ballot in Michigan, maybe.
A number of states.
That could be a marginal benefit to Kamala Harris in Wisconsin.
Having been through all these presidential campaigns and thinking about Wisconsin specifically, what's changed? If you had to say, of all the things that are moving, all the moving pieces on the board, what has fundamentally changed about the way people feel about themselves, perhaps in Wisconsin, the way they vote in Wisconsin? I
mean, the voting behavior has changed a lot. I mean, we're obviously much more polarized. There's way less ticket splitting. There's way fewer people crossing over. We talked about Tommy Thompson. I mean, he used to get in some of his races, 30% of the Democratic vote.
Yeah.
The amount of ticket splitting we used to have is gone. And you see it in these races where we used to see bigger swings. People are freaking out over these tiny, tiny, tiny shifts in the polling. Mm-hmm. But those shifts are nothing compared to the shifts we used to see in races, where events or negative stories would have tangible, measurable effects on the polling. It's just a much more, rigid, less play, fewer voters in play, and really a more locked in, entrenched partisan electorate than when I started covering politics in Wisconsin, in the 80s and 90s.
On election night, you're looking at Wisconsin, you're looking at the map. It's up on all the networks and all the counties. Give me a county or two that you would say, watch these two.
Yeah, I mean, the difficulty here, like I said earlier, is that there are going to be parts of the state going in opposite directions. So if Democrats do better, they're going to do better in Dane County. And if they do better in the Republican suburbs like Waukesha, that will be encouraging to Democrats. But that also happened in 2016, and it didn't prevent Donald Trump from winning the election. So I would look at the small counties and see how much better Donald Trump is doing. If you're looking for sort of just a battleground indicator, I would look at, those places like Brown County and Outagamie County around Green Bay and Appleton, because those Fox Valley counties, Donald Trump, the three big ones, Donald Trump won by about 7 points last time. So which way are they going to shift this time around? I think that's a good indicator, but I don't think there's a single barometer to look at.
Well, Trump traditionally outperforms whatever the poll number is on the final day. You expect more of that so that if we believe in the polls, would say this is already a 50-50 toss-up, that seems to favor possibly the ex-president given the history of underperformance?
I'd be surprised if it was on that scale because, again, I do expect just based on the last two elections with the same Republican on the ballot, a very polarizing figure, I wouldn't expect any kind of real daylight between these candidates. At 1 point Donald Trump victory would not surprise me. A 3 point Donald Trump victory would surprise me. And a 1 point Kamala Harris victory would not surprise me. So, it's been a tough map for Republicans in the Trump era because of some of the trends we've been talking about.
We talk about election day. Now it's something like election week, election month, right? It's likely in a tight election, we're not going to know on election night who's going to win the presidency. But one thing about Wisconsin is it has what's been referred to as the blue shift. So early on, the numbers will probably be favoring however they're going to favor. Later on, the later counting, that's when the blue numbers start to come in, and then everyone's hair is on fire that something must be wrong.
So what's happened in recent elections is that we've had absentee mail ballots. It's far from a majority of the vote. It's probably going to be, 20% or less than 20% of the vote. It was more in the pandemic election of 2020. So what happened was some counties in Wisconsin count those mailed-in ballots at the polling place, essentially, as they're counting the in-person votes. And some cities, notably the city of Milwaukee, have this thing called central count, where they set them aside and then they count them all at once after the polls close.
Right.
And they have not been given the green light from the legislature to start processing those ballots before the polls close, which would help with this problem. And so what's happened in recent elections is that there's been a dump of absentee ballots. And these are city of Milwaukee voters who are very Democratic to begin with. And then the absentee ballot voters were even more Democratic. And so you had, this big, huge vote shift. We could have a repeat, probably fewer absentee ballots, maybe not quite as late in the evening, but we could certainly have a repeat where when those ballots are counted, they move things in a Democratic direction. And so people are just going to have to be prepared for that.
They have to be, and they're not.
And they're not.
You know, right? Do you think it's going to be a verdict, even if it's tight, that would be known within the first 24 to 48 hours? Or are we looking at the better part or balance of the week to get there?
I mean, unless there's some unforeseen disturbance, 2000 was the worst case in terms of the tightest case. And it was like 3 o'clock in the morning, maybe, or 4 o'clock in the morning, but it wasn't days. And so I don't foresee it dragging out again, unless something really unforeseen happens over the course of the week, but it may be in the wee hours.
Is there any correlation between how the vote's going to go and the Green Bay Packers? Is there is a statistical relationship between the fate on the football field and political fate?
There used to be some funny pattern, and I can't even remember what it is now, about, how the Packers did in their final game before Election Day. We've had a lot of patterns like that in Wisconsin, but they don't all last. A lot of precedents have been broken in recent decades, so I can't help you with that one.
You're not helping the bookmakers and the odds makers at all here, Greg.
No help for them either.
Well, obviously, thank you very much for coming in. I love Wisconsin. I love the people there. It is still, I think, a microcosm of so many things in this country. I think when it's all said and done, generally, the people of Wisconsin find a way to pull together. They believe in the words common ground. I just hope we get a verdict from Wisconsin sooner rather than later. Thanks for coming in.
Absolutely.